meetings. My name is Dr. Munir Musa, and I am a volunteer director of a Global Forum for Teacher Educators. On the behalf of Gfte, I warmly welcome all the virtual members from over 65 countries to the third international conference titled My Teaching Journey. I consider teaching not as a profession, rather a reflective journey that leads you to optimism, improvement, selfless devotion, and lifelong education. Teachers should be the symbol of altruism. Your prime concern should not be pulling the legs of other teachers, rather exploring your personal teaching identity and help learners grow ethically and intellectually. I congratulate all the teacher members of Global Forum for following the path of intellectual openness. I started Global Forum for Teacher Educators in 2014 as a human rights initiative. It works free of cost under my socio-eco-ethical model of human rights education and socio-eco-ethical model of social work. It's the first forum in the world that offers free human rights education to children and women of marginalized communities from across the world. We also promote value education among school-going children from across the world through extracurricular activities. We have further supported the professional development of global teachers by offering free workshops, webinars, international conferences, and symposiums. Today's conference is one of such examples. For the past few years, we have been actively engaged in social causes and have helped thousands of children battling cancer, old age people, orphans, visually impaired people, hard to hear people, street children, and others. Today, this forum is working successfully at no cost because of you. All I want to say is gratitude, gratitude, gratitude. I hope you will continue supporting our vision and remain active on our Facebook forum forever as a global member. You are always close to our hearts, thoughts, prayers, and well wishes. Hope you will have good time during 2 days of this international conference. Good luck. Our first keynote speaker is Dr. Anna. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and Humanistic Studies at Western Connecticut State University. She will give a keynote on teaching how to think, not what to think. A warm welcome to you, Dr. Anna. Thank you for accepting my invitation. Over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Just before I start, can everyone hear me? Is it okay, Munir? Can I go on? It feels a bit strange. Okay, great, thank you. Feels a bit strange because apparently you can see and hear me, but I can't hear what Dr. Munir Musa was just saying now. But that's okay. So as Dr. Munir introduced me, he said, my name's Anna Malavisi. And before I begin my presentation, I do just want to say thank you very much to the Global Forum for Teacher Educators, right? and Dr. Manur Musa, the director, volunteer director of this wonderful forum, and to all the teacher educators out there. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. I'm very excited to be here today, and I wish I could hear you. But so I'm going to give a presentation. I would love to hear some questions, get some questions from you in the audience. So while I'm talking, if some questions come up, please post them in the chat, and we can look at them after I finish my presentation. So I'm going to, is this sharing my screen? Okay, so I'm going to go to my presentation. Let me just get it here. Okay, so here we are. So I'm going to start it. Okay, so this title of my presentation, as Dr. Musa has already said, it's how to think and not what to think, right? Okay, so what am I going to do today? I'm going to do an introduction, which I'm sort of doing right now, right? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about my teaching journey, and I'm going to give you some, my teaching journey is sort of where I've got to today in my teaching, some of the lessons I've learned along the way. I'm going to tell you a little bit about two leading educators and one methodology which has instructed my teaching, if you like, over the years. And I'm going to use an example to sort of, what I mean by how to teach students how to think rather than what to think, using sustainability in the climate crisis. And then we'll just conclude it. Okay, so I'm going to start off this presentation with a verse from the Tao Te Ching, which I'm sure many of you are aware, depending where you are in the world, right? So the Tao Te Ching is a classic Chinese text written around the 6th century BCE, a long time ago, by Lao Tzu, although, sort of some scholars these days say that there may have been other writers who contributed to it. But I don't think it really matters who wrote it. I think the wisdom of the words are enough to sort of like share them with you. So the passage that I'm going to talk to you, sort of recite now, is called Healing the Mind. Okay, so it starts like this. Academia confuses knowledge with knowing. Most everyone applauds the memorization of the 10,000 trivia. Beware. These schooled addictions are not just myths. They are a form of mental illness. Any fragment of the mind, divorced from heart, spirit, human community, and from the primal reality of the universe, is an abomination of the great integrity. Let us prepare for the great integrity by cleansing ourselves of all these cobwebs, of cluttered fragments that paralyze the mind. In this way, we will function as our own holistic physicians. So I'll let you think about that for a bit. Now, it's a little bit disconcerting talking sort of to, I'm not too sure there's an audience here, so I just want to go, and I can't see the chat box. So let me just exit this for a minute, and I want to go back to StreetYard just to make sure that it's all good. So Monique, could you just tell me if everything's okay, that you can hear me and you can see the screen, just before I continue. I'd hate to think that nobody can hear me and you can't see what I'm talking about. Munir, are you out there? Is this... Oh, okay. Munir? Oh, thank you. Sorry. Oh, thank you. Okay, that's great. Excellent. So let's go back. I was just concerned. Okay. So we can continue on. Thanks for your patience, everyone. Okay, so in the talk today, what I'm trying to sort of encourage you to all do, or sort of how we can think about this, is we need to cleanse ourselves of all these cobwebs, right? So, and the fragments that paralyze our mind. And how do we do that? So let's move on. So before we do that, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my teaching journey. So here's some photos that represent 4 countries that have also been part of my life experience as a teacher, both in the informal sector and in the formal sector. So my teaching started in Melbourne, in sort of the left-hand corner here, right? That's where I was born and brought up and first started my sort of educational career. So my first teaching experience was in an informal setting as a community health nurse, in a community health centre, trying to teach people how to better live their lives in a in a healthier way, talking about diet, exercise, understanding their conditions, etc., etc. That was very much an informal sort of teaching, if you like. From there, I went to England, where I trained as a midwife, right? And there as well, I was involved in informal teaching to future mothers, whether it was during pregnancy, during labour, or post-labour. Helping women understand their bodies during pregnancy, but also teaching them about the importance of good diet, exercise, and sort of the value of breastfeeding, etc., etc. So once again, that was very sort of an informal setting, right? Then I moved to Bolivia, right, where I lived for 16 years, where I worked in international development. And my first placement, my first job when I went to Bolivia was as a health educator in a small town in the valleys of Cochabamba, where I was a health educator in a town where they were building a dam. So my role was to teach people how to sort of good hygiene practices. Washing hands before and after going to the toilet, going to the bathroom, washing hands before eating, but also good sanitation practices, hygiene, all related to water, but also included, food and everything like that. So a lot of my teaching was to children, to community groups of mothers, of women, but also, all adults in general. And, one of my first experiences was with cholera. When I first got to Bolivia, there was a cholera epidemic. And so it sort of brought home to me the importance of education and the type of education, right? Because it was no use telling people during the cholera epidemic that they needed to wash their hands and wash their hands after they went to the bathroom. If one, they didn't have water in their house, right, or a tap where they could wash their hands. And second, if they didn't have a bathroom, right? So it brought home to me how important the context is, knowing where our students are coming from, their experiences. So which I'll talk about that a bit later. So once again, that was very much the informal setting. Then after 16 years, in 2007, I moved to Michigan, a lovely campus, Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan, where I pursued a degree in a PhD in philosophy. I decided that it was time to think about some of these issues from an ethical perspective. I was a little bit frustrated and disillusioned with global development. So I went to do a PhD and I studied, my dissertation was on global development, rethinking the theory and practice. So all that has instructed my teaching. So now I'm at Western Connecticut State University, where I teach classes, introduction to philosophy classes, peace and justice issues, environmental philosophy, feminist philosophy, also all these different classes in philosophy. All the teaching I do now is very much influenced by my past experience. But not only that, which I'll get to in a minute. Okay, so what are some of the lessons that I've learned over the time? I think we often talk about the importance of education. We think about sort of climate crisis, we think about global poverty, we think about violence, if you like, racism, etc., etc. We all talk about the importance of education. But what I think is equally important is the type of education, how we teach. Right? And our goal is to teach others how to think and not what to think. So how do we do that? Okay, so I'm going to tell you, well, I'm sure you've all heard of them. Well, you may not have heard of Paulo Freire, or some of you would have heard of Paulo Freire, but maybe not everybody, right? But I'm sure that many of you have heard about Socrates, who was an ancient Greek philosopher around the 5th century before the Common Era, right? And Paulo Freire was a Brazilian educator and philosopher, 20th century, a bit later than Socrates. But why do I sort of think they're so important? Well, here's why. So Socrates was known as a peripatetic philosopher. He didn't stay in the classroom, right? Well, actually, there were no classrooms at that time because Plato, one of Socrates' students, was the first one to start an academy where the universities derive their name, right? So at the time when Socrates was around, he would walk around the marketplace, walk around the streets and talk to different groups, a lot of young people, but also adults as well. And his conversation was always around questioning. He challenged people by asking questions and another question and a question, what is justice? What do you understand by justice? Can we think about it this way, etc., etc.? And from that has come the Socratic method or the Socratic dialogue, which I'm sure many of you have heard about it. The Socratic method or Socratic dialogue is something that is used in the classroom today. And unfortunately, Socrates, for this type of work that he was doing, was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth. Fortunately, philosophers today don't get sentenced to death for corrupting people. And I don't think it's a matter of corrupting. I think about it as a gadfly. Someone always sort of like challenging, questioning what's going on. I sort of think, if we think about a modern day gadfly, I think about Greta Thunberg. I think she does a great job in always challenging us and questioning us about what we should be doing about the climate crisis. So the Socratic method or the Socratic dialogue helps students learn about critical thinking, right? It's never confrontational. We don't want confrontation in the classroom as such. We want people to feel comfortable, right? We want to feel that all opinions, all value, are valued in a sense where that we want to hear people's contributions, right? It encourages taking some intellectual risks, in a sense, trying to get out of your comfort zone, trying to listen to other perspectives, listen to opinions counter your own, and trying to think understanding why someone may think that, trying to find out why they do think that, right? What the Socratic dialogue encourages is questioning one's own assumptions, values, and beliefs. So Paulo Freire, which I think, comes down from Socratic thinking as well. So Paulo Freire, a 20th century educator and philosopher, was very important and very prominent in the education field, I think still now, right, for his critical pedagogy. So Paulo Freire ran literacy programs for poor Brazilians, but he wasn't not only interested in teaching Brazilians how to read and write. What he thought was also very important, to help them, what he called, get them to understand why they were poor in the first place. So what it was a process of conscientización. That conscientización means that sort of like a self-realization about one's situation and why they are poor. Often with poverty, people are victim blamed in a sense where you're poor because you're lazy and you didn't work or whatever. We've got to move away from that sort of way of thinking. We've got to understand that poverty is usually related or is caused by very much structural factors. So this process of conscientization helps you realize that, and it's done through dialogue. Right? So the processes of reflection and action, there's a dialectical tension between the theory and practice. So oftentimes the theory, and in academia especially, the theory is divorced from the practice. For Freire is, and for me too, what is really important, working with that dialectical tension between the theory and practice. So what Freire talks about, he says that teachers need fundamental knowledges, or should have these, fundamental knowledges. And what he says that teaching requires recognition that education is ideological, right? But also recognizing that sometimes those ideologies are false, or not necessarily good ones. Teaching requires ethics. Teaching requires a capacity to be critical. Teaching requires the recognition of our conditions, but also the conditions of our students. Teaching requires humility. And I think this is where Socrates comes into it again. One of Socrates' most famous lines is, "All I know is that I know nothing." Right? So he's starting from a very humble position. Right? And teaching requires critical reflection. Some more things about Freire. So for Freire, dialogue teaching cannot be reduced to the depositing of ideas from one to another. Nor is it a simple exchange of ideas. Dialogue only takes place in the absence of domination of one over the other. And I think it's just worthwhile spending some time over this, because in the classroom, there's a natural sort of power dynamic, and that we can't really avoid. A natural power dynamic between teacher and student. But it very much also depends on how that student, or how the teacher exercises that power over, and sort of makes it gives some power to students by valuing what they have to say, asking them what they have to say, knowing where they're coming from. So there is some ways of how we can shift that power, some of that power, to the students. Teaching also needs to happen in the presence of love, faith, and humility. And when we talk about love, it's not an erotic form of love. It's love that is more akin to what Martin Luther King thought love is. Gandhi talks about love. It's the love of all, the love of mankind. It's that expansion of love. And I think Dr. Musa was clear about that in that sort of, because I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see written under that, share your love, right? That's the type of love that we want. Faith. It doesn't necessarily have to be a religious faith. It can be, but I think people that don't necessarily have a religious faith can have a faith in people. We need to think that there are some wonderful people out there. Let's have faith in ourselves a bit more, right? And humility. Once again, true dialogue cannot exist without hope, right? There needs to be hope for the future. I know that the future looks a bit dismal, right? But we have to have hope. And we always have to live with a notion of hope. And critical thinking, that cannot be accentuated enough. So this is just reaffirming that action, reflection, both need to exist. The theory, the praxis, right? And what happens when you only have one? Well, you sacrifice action and it turns into verbalism, pure rhetoric, right? You sacrifice reflection and you have pure activism. So to really if we want to really have transformative change, we have to have both action and reflection. Humans are not built in silence, but in word, in work, in action, reflection, right? Dialogue is an existential necessity. So what he means by that, as humans, we are social beings, right? We depend on other people. We relate to other people for our existence. And that existence depends on dialogue, right? So that's why it is so important. And this is an excerpt of probably Freire's most seminal book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I'm going to read this quote because I think it really aptly describes what he's trying to get at. So Freire says, the object of dialogical libertarian action is not to dislodge the oppressed from a mythological reality in order to bind them to another reality. The object is to make it possible for the oppressed, by perceiving their adhesion, to opt to transform an unjust reality. And this is where the process of conscientisation comes into it. To be able to opt to transform an unjust reality, you need to be aware and understand what that unjust reality is. So that's why the process of conscientization is really important. So once again, the dialogical process needs to be reflection, action, cannot be limited to a simple exchange of ideas. The process of conscientization needs time. It can take years. And it often requires some form of structured dialogue as an ongoing practice. So it can't just be 1 or 2 classes or even one semester. This sort of type of practice needs to be ongoing. Once again, it needs to take place within a framework that espouses love, faith, hope, and humility, and critical thinking essential. So if at any time, because at any one time, I may be introducing some concepts that people are not too sure of or not really understand, or you wanted to sort of have me explain, please put them in the chat, and once I've finished, I think we will have time to be able to respond to questions, comments, etc. I do really value the participation of you all. I know it might be difficult depending on how many people there are, right? So just some final thoughts about Freire's work, right? So Freire's dialogical approaches not only relevant for the oppressed, right, but just as relevant for those working with the oppressed. And I think that's really, really important to keep in mind. And critical analysis and reflection needs to take place about understanding the causes of structural injustice. And what I mean by structural injustice is the injustice that is created and caused by structural causes. And by structural we mean the social systems that make up our world. If you want to think about it on a global scale, the global economic order, the agreements, the policies, the programs that happen at a global level, but you can also think about structural injustices at the level of nation states, the politics, the type of government, the programs, but also culturally as well, politically and socially. All these are structural factors, which are often really difficult to budge, right? Okay, and so I said that 2 educators, Socrates and Paulo Freire, but also a methodology has instructed my own teaching over these past few years. So the methodology that I want to mention is a feminist methodology coming from feminist theory, feminist philosophy, right? And what it is it's a feminist standpoint where what it means is starting from the lives of whom you are teaching. So when you teach anywhere, you want to be able to know who you're teaching. Who are they? What have been their experiences? What context are they living in? Do they have to walk miles to get to school? Have they had breakfast before coming to school? Do they have lunch with them if the school doesn't provide lunch? In this sort of digital world, do they have a computer? Do they have a computer at home? Do they have access to internet at home? What is their family life like? Do they have are they homeless? So starting from the lives of whom you are teaching helps one to recognize from where the student's learning is departing from, the context in which students are living. And I think in any teaching, I think that's always really important, knowing the experiences of your students. So now I'm going to share with you an example, right, using sustainability and the climate crisis. And I tend to think that no teaching these days, particularly if you're teaching sort of younger people, right, whether it's K-12, it's junior, middle school, high school, whatever, I think any sort of teaching that we do needs to have some component of sustainability and the climate crisis, right? So I'm starting off from the premise that the current global context is unsustainable. And I think we have to accept it as that. And what that means is that if we continue living the way we have been living, we're just making the human species extinct. The Earth will probably still continue, right? But our species will disappear because we're not going to be able to live in elevated temperatures. We're not going to have the land, the water necessary to sustain us, right? So that's why I think it's really important. But this is an example of why it's important how to think, rather what to think. What does sustainability mean? I think sustainability is such an overused, misunderstood, diluted concept that it really needs some rethinking. Right? So in 1983 was when the sustainability sort of word first came into mode, when it was used by the UN to describe sustainable development. The unfortunate thing that this definition of sustainability still continues and is still being used. So what it is to ensure that it meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now think about this. To ensure that it meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Well, think about it. We are unable to meet the needs of the present. That's not because we don't have the resources. It's because of lack of political will, right? In our current earth, there is enough food, right, and water currently to meet the needs of the present. Yet we are still not able to do it. So we're compromising the current generation, right? So to think about compromising the ability of future generations is sort of, it's type of an anathema, right? Anyway, so also one of the problems with this is the fact that it's very anthropocentric, and what I mean by that is it's human-centered, right? So let's have a look at this. So anthropocentrism, it denotes a human-centered approach. So how we think about the environment, right, is very much humans and the environment. We've got to move away from that thinking. We cannot think about the environment purely based on our interests, because we have been doing that for too long. And the result is today, now we are extinguishing not only non-human beings, but also natural resources. Okay? So we have to think about, another way of thinking, how we have thought about anthropocentrism is that it's been based on the dominion thesis. And the dominion thesis is that humans have dominion over non-humans, as written in the Bible. This is something we have carried with us for centuries, right? And this can be challenged, okay? We cannot think about our place in the environment from an anthropocentric view. So I'm going to introduce another concept, right? But I think what I also would suggest is that this is a great opportunity to create your own concept in class with your students. But I'll give you an example of another concept. Sustainability refers to the ability of an ecosystem to hold, endure, or bear the weight of a wide variety of social and natural forces which could compromise its healthy operation. Now, what I like about this is it talks about the ecosystem. So it talks about humans, non-human beings, but also other living beings. The trees, the plants, the mountains, the oceans, etc., etc. Endure or bear the weight of a wide variety of social and natural forces. Of course, we know that there's natural forces, fluctuations. A lot of the natural forces have been only instigated by our sort of actions, of human anthropogenic actions. But it also talks about social forces that are anthropogenic or human-caused, right? Which could compromise its healthy operation. And we have compromised its healthy operation. But it captures much more, right? So the idea is that we require a paradigm shift. We have to move from an anthropocentric view to a view that is ecocentric. A shift from humans and the environment to humans as part of the environment. Think about it this way. Rainforests are not going to miss humans as much as humans will miss rainforests. I'll let you think about that. So the ecocentric paradigm, if you like, is much more concerned with a respect thesis. And what does this mean? That human actions are to be guided by respect, care, and concern for the natural world. So we can think about respecting others, respecting human beings. But this also entails a respect for non-human beings and also respect, concern for the natural world, right? For the rivers, the mountains, and the oceans, something that we have not been very good at. It rejects the human egoistic thesis that we only do all our actions are based on the interests of ourselves and other humans. Once again, we have to move away from that sort of thinking. So thinking about sustainability, to begin to think about sustainability, very much will depend on how we see ourselves within this world. It very much depends on how we see, how we understand, how we live our relationship with others. But these others is not only limited to other human beings, but also to non-human beings, and once again, to the ecosystem. Requires an understanding of the intrinsic value of other living and non-living beings that share in the environment. And what I mean by intrinsic value, that it has value in and of itself. So we can think about human beings, just living human beings, as being valuable just for living, right? A human being is valuable in and of itself. But we can extend this intrinsic value to trees. A tree is valuable just for being a tree. Yes, we know it emits oxygen. We know it provides paper, but it also has value in and of itself. Just for being a tree, it has wonderful aesthetic value to begin with. So I suppose what I'm trying to emphasize with this is how we think about sustainability will guide our actions. Right? So I'm nearly finished here, right? So I just wanted to offer some concluding thoughts. The teacher does not know everything. Once again, going back to Socrates, all I know is that I know nothing, right? The student-teacher relationship is one of reciprocity. We learn and teach students just as much as we teach and learn from them, right? So I think also that's one way. If we as teachers are aware of that value of reciprocity, that's going to reduce the power dynamic sort of between teacher and student, right? And helping students how to think will be long-lasting. Right? So that's it. And I hope I didn't rush through some of the slides. And please, like I said, please feel free to ask me questions, challenge anything that I've said. I would love to, I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I'd like to sort of, let me see, I'll have to go back into StreetYard. Okay. Please share a few tips to promote humility among teachers. That's nice. You know what? The first step to being humble is being aware of it. So humility is really sort of just thinking about where you're coming from. Just that, once again, realizing that we don't know everything, being open to listening to others, being open to new perspectives, ways of thinking, challenging one's own assumptions. These are all things that will lead to humility, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's an excellent question. How can we be sustainability friendly? Yes, once again, that's another way that we can teach how to think. That's a very interesting and a very important question. I ask myself that all the time, living in the United States. The United States is a consumerist society. We are bombarded still with, the need to consume, the need to buy, the need to, keep up with the Joneses, all that. So, but, okay, there are lots of sort of groups that are now working towards that, challenging that consumer society. It's hard, but it's not not impossible, I suppose, right? So how can we be sustainably friendly? Thinking about our own consuming actions, what we buy, right? How we buy, right? So I'll just continue responding this one. So yes, we need to really, it does, okay, so the problem with the climate crisis is going to require individual change and structural change, right? So I hear a lot of people saying, oh, but what I do is not enough, right? Because what I do is, if we all think that what I do is not important, then of course we go nowhere. However, if all of us were to think that what I did was important, then we're going to get a lot further. Think about it this way. If 10 people recycle their paper and their consumables and all that sort of thing, then it's not going to have much of an impact. But if 100,000, it's not going to have much of an impact. But if millions and millions of people recycle, it's going to have more of an impact, right? So it very much depends on our living, anything that we do, right? So what are some causes of structural injustice? That's a good question too. History, colonialism, right? Imperialism, the power of nation states, right? Patriarchy, religion, right? These are some of the factors that have contributed to the global economic order, the way that the global economic order is structured, where rich countries benefit, the trade agreements, which often benefit richer countries than poorer countries. So it's a conglomerate of factors. It's not, you can't just say it's one, there's a mixture. But that's what makes it so complex and so complicated, right? Now, I don't know if people have follow-up questions, want me to talk about a little bit more about, I'm not too sure how much time I have, Monia. But please, keep the questions coming. Comments too, I'd love to hear some of your own experiences.
Our last keynote speaker for today is Lauren Mieno. She is a consultant focusing on equity and justice in nonprofit organizations. The title of her talk is Making Our School Safer for Students of Diverse Genders. A warm welcome to you, Lauren. Over to you.
Hello. I am very excited to be here with you all. I was logged on earlier for the earlier presentation, and I saw many of you from many different countries saying hello, and it was just so exciting to me to see all of you here today. I want to thank Dr. Musa and the Global Forum for Teacher Educators. I'm so impressed with the work that you do and how hard you work. And I just also want to thank all of you who are here today for caring about human rights and struggling for human rights and for the work you do as educators. Thank you so much, especially during these times of pandemic. I know that your work is not easy. I am going to share my screen, and my screen is a presentation, as I said earlier, or as I was introduced, about making schools safer for children of diverse genders. And let's see if the screen sharing is working. All right. So I'd like to share a little bit about my teaching journey and what brought me to this work. I really didn't ever think that I would be a gender educator, but it became a passion for me because of my child. My child, Danny, was assigned male when he was born, but he never fit the expectations society had for boys. Danny is now an adult and identifies as non-binary, which means he doesn't fit into society's categories of man or woman. Danny uses both he and they pronouns, and in this talk, you'll hear me refer to Danny either as he or him, or they or them. So in Danny's early childhood, he was just happy being who they were and didn't try to hide their personality at all. They would put on skirts and played with girls at preschool, and when guests came over, they would run to show them his dress-up clothes. Early on, I started to think that maybe something was wrong with Danny. His father had died shortly after I got pregnant, and I thought maybe the trauma I suffered when I was pregnant had done something to harm him. A friend told me Danny needed a male role model to teach him more masculine ways, and I felt a lot of pressure. I felt like I needed to remarry so that Danny could have a dad. I mostly allowed Danny to be who he was, but there were subtle ways I tried to steer him to be more like other boys. I meant well, but I actually became part of the problem. If I'd known what I know now about gender, I wouldn't have worried so much. I wouldn't have tried to change Danny. I would have supported Danny, and I would have cheered them on. I became a gender educator so I could share some of what I've learned. I hope what I share can help you support the transgender and gender nonconforming students in your schools, whether or not you know they're there. When I tried to steer my child to be more like other boys, I meant well, but I was sending him the message that something was wrong with him. This was especially hurtful because he got this message from other places all the time. I had to shift my mindset to support my child. Now I understand that transgender and gender nonconforming children and youth face many problems, but they are not the problem. The problems that transgender and gender nonconforming people face stem from how our societies mistreat and marginalize them. They stem from transphobia, injustice, and violation of human rights in schools, in communities, in families, and other institutions. So the focus of my presentation isn't on the people who face the problems. It's on the ideas and systems that cause the problems. These ideas and systems need to change so that our transgender and gender nonconforming students can be safe in school and thrive And I'm also just noting from Dr. Anna's presentation, the whole idea of clearing out the cobwebs. For me, it was clearing out the cobwebs around my ideas about gender and conscientization, like really developing critical thinking about all the assumptions I had learned about gender. So I only have a short time with you today and will only cover a taste of what it takes to make schools safer. But I hope that you at least leave here with a desire to unlearn either or ways of thinking about gender and organizing our lives around gender. And I also hope you leave here with some ideas and inspiration to make the school environment safer for transgender and gender nonconforming students to be who they are. What I share may also be relevant to you as parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents, people who have children in your lives. Maybe you won't agree with everything. That's okay. My only ask is that you listen with generosity and stay as open as you can. I've already been using a couple of terms such as transgender and gender nonconforming that I'd like to define for you. But before I do, it's important to discuss this question. When do we know a child's gender? You may want to reflect on that for yourself. When did you know your own gender? I don't remember ever realizing at a specific moment that I was a girl. I took my gender for granted and I never questioned it. I grew up thinking that you knew a child's gender when they were born. I never questioned this. I took it for granted that a child's body, specifically their genitals, tells us what gender they are when they're born. But being a parent, I learned that I needed to question a lot of these assumptions. I mentioned earlier that we'd focus on the ideas and systems that cause problems. In order to understand the terms I'm using, it's important to understand a systemic problem that children with diverse genders face in many countries. That is that sex is assigned when a child is born. Usually, the sex choices are male or female. And based on that sex assignment, a gender is presumed, usually boy or girl. We call this assigned sex because that's what happens. And you could also call it assigned gender because that's essentially what happens. People tend to use the words sex and gender interchangeably, but the two aren't the same, even though they are related. I, along with many other parents, thought I knew the gender of my child when they were born. The first thing I was told about my child was that they were a boy. His assigned sex was male, and all the adults, medical professionals, family members, etc., presumed him to be a boy. For a long time, I thought my child was a boy who liked things that were girly, but still a boy. But I didn't actually know my child's gender until much later when he told me he was non-binary. Like many families with transgender children, I learned that we don't know the gender of our children when they're born. Many transgender children and their families know that anatomy, specifically genitalia, don't determine gender. Therefore, we don't know a child's gender when they're born. An individual's gender is a person's internal experience of having a gender, or sometimes no gender at all. It comes from within us, and it isn't something we choose. Some people refer to this as gender identity. The widespread practice of assigning sex and presuming gender at birth poses a huge problem for transgender and non-binary children because it puts them in a position of having to push up against pressures to fit into a gender that just doesn't fit with who they are. So when do we know a child's gender? The answer is it varies. It depends when our child lets us know, and it could even be when they're an adult. We might know in early childhood, and we might know much later or not at all. If children have a safe environment to be who they are, it makes it much easier to let the adults around them know. An individual's understanding of their gender and the words they use to describe their gender and how they present themselves to the world may also change, but they're the same person. Now let's go into some terms. So I want to acknowledge that these terms may be completely different in different cultures and may not have translations in all languages. In fact, I'm sure they don't have translations in all languages, but I'm going to be defining them for you now so that you'll know what I mean when I use them. Transgender is an umbrella term for anyone who doesn't identify with the gender they were assumed to be at birth. For example, a child being raised as a girl may actually be 100% certain that they're a boy. A child being raised as a boy may insist that they're a girl, and a child being raised as any gender may not identify with being a boy or a girl. They may be non-binary. Non-binary people, like my child, are also under the umbrella of transgender. Non-binary people don't identify exclusively with being a boy or man, girl or woman, and sometimes don't identify with any gender. We don't have good data for how many children and youth are transgender. Surveys show that anywhere between 2 to 9% of children are transgender, children and youth. There may be transgender students in your schools that you're not aware of, either because it's unsafe to be open about one's identity or because they're still figuring it out. Being transgender is not a mental disorder, and this is something which the World Health Organization only recognized officially in 2019. One misconception I'd like to clear up is the idea that a person can't be transgender unless they've had medical procedures such as hormones or surgery to affirm their gender. This is not the case because one's gender identity comes from within, and it's a deeply held sense of who we are. Unfortunately, many governments don't see it that way. Another term I use is gender nonconforming. This term refers to anyone who doesn't conform to society's expectations based on gender, also called gender norms. Almost 1 in 10 elementary school students, about 8%, report that they're boys who others sometimes think, act, or look like a girl, or girls who others sometimes think, act, or look like a boy. This is a lot of children. Another term I will use is cisgender. Many people go through life without having a problem with the gender they were assigned at birth. You're born, you're declared a boy or a girl, and you're basically okay with it. The word for this is cisgender. I am a cisgender woman. I was assigned a sex, female, at birth, and simultaneously assigned a gender, girl. I'm basically okay with that identity for myself. It feels okay to me. Sometimes people use the term normal when referring to people who are cisgender. So think about that. That's a very harmful way to refer to people because it implies that transgender people aren't normal. So part of the shift in mindset that I mentioned earlier is recognizing that cisgender people, like myself, are no more normal than transgender and gender nonconforming people. As a cisgender person, I don't know what it's like to be transgender or gender nonconforming, and I won't try to speak about that. I speak from my limited knowledge with a lot of humility as a cisgender woman, a mother, and a person who is learning. And I owe much of what I've learned to transgender activists and educators, as well as my own child. So let's go into some of the problems that many transgender and gender nonconforming students deal with in schools. Around first grade, my child, Danny, started to get teased and mistreated by both children and adults. Whereas before, he was happy being who he was. He started to think something was wrong with him. He complained a lot of stomach aches and missed a lot of school. He changed the way he dressed to avoid being teased. We live in a liberal town, so Danny had it easy compared to a lot of children. This is data from the United States, but these challenges exist in many countries. Children who don't conform to society's gender norms are more likely to be bullied and miss school because they feel unsafe. And again, this is a lot of children. This is maybe 1 in 10 children who are experiencing this. Data for older students shows similar patterns. Transgender youth are more likely than cisgender students to be harassed and feel unsafe at school. They're more likely to avoid school spaces like locker rooms and bathrooms, and they're more likely to miss school or change schools. They're also more likely to experience discrimination. Also, transgender students in many countries report that teachers don't support them when they are bullied and may actually be worse than peers in mistreating students. That's that power over dynamic that Dr. Anna spoke about earlier. Many students who are rejected by their families are forced to leave school to work to support themselves, and many end up homeless. And more than half of transgender and non-binary youth have seriously considered suicide. And that's according to a study by the Trevor Project. So why do transgender and gender nonconforming kids experience these problems? Why did I, as a parent, try to change my child? Why are transgender and non-binary students mistreated in schools? These problems are all connected to a system called the gender binary. And that system is connected to many of the systems that Dr. Anna spoke about in her previous presentation. So what is the gender binary? It's a culturally and socially defined code of acceptable and expected behaviors. The binary recognizes only two opposite genders as legitimate. It's an either-or way of looking at gender that lives in our ideas, in our behaviors, in our relationships, in our systems, and in our institutions. These two supposedly opposite genders in the binary are not equal. The binary also assumes superiority of men over women, the same system that causes discrimination and violence against cisgender women also causes discrimination and violence against transgender and gender nonconforming people. The binary is not something that comes from nature. Gender diversity is natural among humans and other animals, but in many societies, the binary is seen as the natural order of things. By the very nature of this system, transgender and non-binary people do not belong. Even in cases where transgender people or a third gender are legally recognized, they're discriminated against and marginalized from full participation in society many times. So there's this common belief that gender diversity is new and it comes from Western society. And this is most definitely not the case. People of different genders outside the binary have existed for many generations in many cultures, and these are just some examples. Many people of different genders have played historically or even currently play valued roles in their community. Colonization and the spread of Western ideas has included the imposition of gender binary systems and ideas on cultures with diverse genders. As a result, many people who hold these gender identities have been marginalized, and in some cases, there's now very little knowledge of their existence or of their roles in society. So often activists, when they talk about gender justice, they're really talking about decolonizing gender because of this connection between colonization and the systemic marginalization of people of diverse genders. Going back to the gender binary, not all cultures follow the same strict binary, and expectations for gender aren't the same everywhere. But for those that do, as soon as a child is born, there's a path they're expected to follow, which could be called the gender binary path. Once the gender assignment is made, children are expected to stick to their assignment of being either a boy or a girl. Being transgender is not allowed or is looked down on. Being non-binary is not an option. It's assumed that everyone is either a cisgender boy or a girl, man or woman, or does not belong. Along this path, there are adults and peers who inundate them with lots of expectations about who they are, what to wear, what toys to play with, what roles you play within the family. Being gender nonconforming is not an option. One of the rules, or also called gender norms, in the gender binary is who you can partner with. In the gender binary, men are supposed to partner with women and women with men. People who are lesbian, gay, and bisexual are breaking the rules of the gender binary. There are lots and lots of rules which are different in different cultures. Maybe some of these ring true for you. Boys don't cry. Men should be strong and able to support their families. Girls should be pretty, sweet, and obedient and learn to cook and clean. These rules also play out in policies like exclusion of transgender children from sports, gendered school uniforms, laws against same-sex marriage, and gender on identification documents. Can you think of other examples? The binary, while it reinforces male dominance, harms everyone, including cisgender men. It punishes anyone who doesn't live by the rules. Gender policing is when we enforce the expectations of the gender binary, and we often do this as adults. For example, Danny was told he couldn't play with the girls and had to play soccer or football with the boys. This policing can be extreme and can include violence from family members. It also pressures people to prove their masculinity or femininity. It creates a climate of fear and violence. People fear being ridiculed or bullied if they don't live up to society's gender expectations. I felt helpless as I watched my child go through a difficult time to the point that they weren't sure they wanted to live anymore. The binary also restricts what we can do and how we can grow. It damages self-esteem because most people can't live up to the unrealistic expectations placed on our genders. It justifies discrimination against people who don't fit into the binary or don't follow the rules. So shifting away from the gender binary, because it really harms everyone, won't just make life better for transgender and gender nonconforming people. It will make life better for all of us. The binary isn't inherent in nature, and that's good news. It means that it can be changed. What if there was a massive shift in mindset? I'm thinking of, the mindset or the behavior change that Dr. Anna talked about recycling. What if there was a similar massive shift in mindset around gender? What if these rules and systems didn't exist and people could be free to be who they are? I think about that for my child and how their life would have been different if they could just be who they are without being pressured to be and act more like boys are expected to be and act. And I think about what it would be like for everyone who is impacted by gender-based violence and discrimination. What would it be like to live without fear of violence? What would it be like to be treated fairly and equally by the people around you and the institutions that are part of your lives? I also think about that for myself. I wonder how the possibilities for my life were narrowed based on my gender. Part of shifting mindset is unlearning things that we've been taught that don't serve us, that critical thinking that Dr. Anna talked about. Here are some of the things that you can do if you're interested in unlearning rigid ideas about gender. Notice how the gender binary lives within you. What are the beliefs you grew up with? Are you willing to examine and rethink them? What are biases you hold about what's okay for a girl and okay for a boy? What are some behaviors or habits you bring into the classroom? Do you encourage boys in certain ways and girls in others? Do you only read books that have cisgender children? If you remember nothing else from today, I hope you remember this one core idea that needs to shift. The idea that our gender is determined by our genitalia, our bodies, or how we look or sound. When we shift away from this idea, we can also shift away from making assumptions about a person's gender from the time they are born and throughout their lives. Misgendering is when we refer to someone using a name, a pronoun like she, he, or they, or an honorific like Miss or Mr., or words like boy or girl that don't reflect the gender with which they identify. This can be more of a problem or less of a problem depending upon the language you're speaking. For example, some languages use gender-neutral pronouns. Transgender and non-binary people often experience misgendering throughout their lives, which can contribute to mental health problems. And conversely, if someone is not misgendered and their gender is respected, it reduces the risk of suicide and really improves mental health. As we move away from rigid and binary ways of thinking about gender, we can develop a more expansive understanding of gender. It becomes possible to recognize and value people of all genders. Rather than being stuck in the idea that there are only two genders, we can now recognize the universe of genders that exist. By expanding our understanding of gender, we create space for people to be themselves. This freedom to be oneself isn't just a minor concern. It's core to a person's health, well-being, and happiness. There's a growing recognition that many people identify outside of the binary. There's no one fixed set of terms people use to refer to themselves, and they're often different in different languages or cultures. But you can see from this document here on the left, just some examples of the many ways that people refer to themselves. Now I invite you to reflect. That whole reflection process that Dr. Anna talked about. Think about your school. What are some of the systemic problems that impact transgender and gender nonconforming students? What are opportunities to change them to make schools safer and more welcoming? Think about school policies ranging from records and forms to dress codes and access to bathrooms and locker rooms. Imagine not being able to go to the bathroom safely for an entire school day. Think about the curriculum. Are transgender and gender nonconforming people represented? Are we teaching students that being cisgender is the norm or the only way to be? Think about the physical environment. Are there images and signs welcoming students and families with diverse identities? Are there gender-neutral bathrooms? Think about educator awareness and skills. What are educators learning about how to make the school environment safe and supportive for students of all genders? Are there biases that are playing out in things such as disproportionate discipline? Think about access to supports such as counselors with knowledge and skills to provide effective support, or student groups. Think about what is being done to prevent bullying, which can be verbal, physical, social, and then of course there's also cyberbullying. What is done to intervene if and when these things happen? Maybe you don't have the power to change the entire construct around gender and all the policies around it, especially if your school district or government is very conservative. But there are some things you may be able to do to help us move away from it. Here are some examples of things to avoid and things you can do to make a difference in the quality of life for transgender and gender nonconforming students. Avoid, if you can, separating students by gender, limiting clothes, learning, play, toys, colors, etc., and assuming someone's gender and, of course, misgendering. Alternatives, maybe find different ways to group people that aren't just based on gender for activities in classrooms. Encourage a wide range of activities and expressions for all students, not just limited to gender. And remember that anyone can identify in any way. Use the name and the pronoun a student uses for themselves. Books can make a huge difference in the schools. For transgender and gender nonconforming students, they serve as a mirror to affirm and evaluate and validate that they're beautiful, that they belong, and that they aren't alone. For cisgender students, they provide a window into the lives of children who are different than themselves and build greater empathy and also reduce bullying. This is the cover of a book I wrote called One of a Kind Like Me. It's about a child who is assigned the gender of a boy who wants to be a princess in the school parade. It's bilingual in English and Spanish and has been used by many teachers and districts to start conversations with children about gender stereotypes and gender diversity. The book doesn't touch directly on gender identity. It's about children being free to be who they are and being affirmed and celebrated. It's not about a kid who is bullied or mistreated. It's about a kid who is supported by his family and community. There's a growing body of books, and I especially encourage you to check out books written by transgender and gender nonconforming people. My book was recently challenged in a conservative school district. They said it wasn't age appropriate for young kids. But what I've seen when I talk with many children and teachers is that children don't have any problems with these conversations. They're generally open and curious. It's adults who have the hardest time and project our fears onto children. Just a few more slides, and then we're going to be able to take some questions. For students who are not only transgender and gender nonconforming, but also gay, lesbian, bisexual, and other sexual orientation, one caring adult can make a huge difference. LGBTQ youth who report having at least one accepting adult were 40% less likely to report a suicide attempt in the past year. Consider how you can be that caring adult for the children in your school. Could you post a safe space sign? What are other ways to let students know you care without violating their privacy? What I've touched on here today is just a small introduction. You can't learn all you need to learn in one workshop, but there are resources available to help you keep learning. Here's an Asian Pacific report on school bullying, violence, and discrimination, which has lots of valuable information, and there are many more resources available online. The link for this report will be sent out today after today's session. And I really want to echo what Dr. Anna said. Teachers don't have to have all the answers, and we're learners as well, and just really allow for your own learning curve. And then one other point that I want to stress or encourage is wherever you are, remember you aren't alone. There is community somewhere. There are transgender organizations and leaders advocating for their rights and building critically needed support system. Here's a report that maps out some of those organizations in Asia. Sorry about that slide. I didn't edit the slide correctly. You can ignore what the words on the slide. There are several organizations doing this work, and even private Facebook groups where people can connect with other parents. Many of the parents that I have met, myself included, may have started out confused or scared about having a child who is transgender, non-binary, or gender non-conforming. Many of us have shifted our own mindsets. We now celebrate our children for who they are and appreciate the example they're setting for us, breaking away from rigid ways of thinking about gender and showing us that gender doesn't have to limit who we can be. We appreciate anything you can do as educators to help make our schools and our world safer for all of our children. Thank you so much for listening. My website will be shared with you after this session, and you are more than welcome to reach out. And I believe we have time for a few questions. I'm going to stop sharing now. I see the question. In many countries, teachers cannot help students in such situations. Shouldn't it be treated as a topic in kindergarten? I completely agree that it should be treated as a topic in kindergarten. Of course, age-appropriate information always. And depending on where you are, that may or may not be allowed, right? And so that's one of the things that we're dealing with is restrictions in governments and school districts and in the climate in which you're in, where even just the safety issue is a really big one. But ultimately, I think, and ideally, this is something, education that can start as early as possible. Thank you for the question. Yes, we do need awareness campaigns. And I think that the point that Dr. Anna made earlier about clearing out the cobwebs, we've got a lot of cobwebs to clear out. And part of the awareness is like just being aware of how many biases we have. There's systems changes that can be made as well, depending again on where you are and how much openness and how much support you can get for making those kinds of systems change. Thank you so much for your comment. It is very much possible to teach this topic at school levels, depending again on the climate in your district and in your community. The example that I gave of where my book was challenged, there were actually parents who did not want their children to read my book. And they organized against the book. And part of the it was a very Christian, very conservative community. And they felt that this book was promoting gender identity politics. And, it's really important for me to be able to hear their perspective. And it's also really important for them to be able to open their minds and understand, well, if you're saying that a book that's about a child that's pretty much just like my child is not welcome in your school, then you're actually saying my child is not welcome in your school. And this isn't a minor issue. It is really an issue of life and death, because so many transgender children are at very high risk for suicide. And the more we mistreat and marginalize them, the more that risk goes up. So the more education, the more books, the more curriculum, the more ways that we can make transgender and gender nonconforming people feel welcome, the safer they will be. Can you please, how to encourage parents and teachers to accept gender identity of their children? That's a really tough one, because first of all, you have to be able to have the conversation. I can speak for parents because I do a lot of work with parents, that having places to be able to have that conversation is really important. So for example, there's a private Facebook group of parents of LGBTQ plus children, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, etc. children. And it's a private space where people can have those kinds of conversations where they don't feel safe to have them publicly. And if you have the ability to have forums such as this for teachers in your district, I think one of the things is really hearing the personal stories. There are videos, transgender leaders and including students have done a lot of videos sharing their experience, and hearing firsthand from them about their experience is really, really important. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate you being here today, and thank you for your questions.